The planet of Thalmaris was a beautiful, peaceful place. Its tall cities were built on mountains that reached toward the stars. The people of Thalmaris, known for their advanced technology and wisdom, had long lived in harmony. The royal family, the House of Alder, ruled with fairness and strength. But for Princess Lyra, the only daughter of King Aldar, her world was crumbling. Lyra stood by the large window of her chamber, looking out at the distant city below. Her thoughts were heavy. She had been raised to one day rule Thalmaris, but there was a deep problem. Lyra was barren. No matter how hard she tried, she could not produce an heir. In the eyes of her people and her family, this was a failure. Her father, King Alder, had always been proud of his daughter. She was smart, kind, and brave. But there was one thing she could not do: bring life to the next generation of the royal family. In their eyes, that made her useless. For days, Lyra had tried to ignore the whispers around her. The Council of Thalmaris had spoken behind her back, questioning her worth as the future ruler. "A queen without heirs," they said. "What good is she?" Their voices, once full of respect, now only brought pain. Her father had called her into the royal chamber that morning. She had expected words of comfort, as he had always done in the past. But today, the words were harsh. "My daughter," the king said, his voice cold and distant, "you have failed us." Lyra's heart sank. She had never heard her father speak to her like this before. "I have done everything I can to prepare you for the throne," he continued, "but your inability to carry on the bloodline leaves us with no choice." "Father, please," Lyra began, but the king raised his hand to silence her. "You are no longer fit to rule," he said sharply. "The council has made their decision. You will be exiled." Exiled. The word echoed in Lyra's mind. How could this be happening? She had spent her whole life training for this moment. She had always been loyal to her people. She had dreamed of leading them into a future of peace and prosperity. But now it seemed that her dreams were shattered. Her father turned away from her, signaling that the conversation was over. Lyra felt her world collapse around her. The guards came to escort her from the chamber, but she could barely move. She felt numb, as if her body was no longer her own. The king's decision was swift. The royal advisors had already prepared the papers, and within hours, Lyra's exile was official. She was no longer the princess. She was a mere wanderer, cast out of the palace that had once been her home. Lyra's belongings were quickly packed. She was given nothing but a small travel bag filled with essentials. Her personal guards, once loyal to her, now turned their backs and left her to face the unknown. The last thing she saw as she left the palace was her father's cold face, his eyes devoid of the warmth they once shared. The journey to her new life was long and harsh. Lyra was sent to the outskirts of the kingdom, to a small village far from the capital. It was a place where few traveled, and even fewer returned. The people there were poor and unkind, and the roads were treacherous. Lyra had no choice but to walk alone, her pride shattered, her heart broken. As she traveled, she encountered few who offered any help. Some looked at her with pity, others with disdain. To them, she was no different from any other person in exile. She had no title, no family, no future, but one thing remained: Lyra's determination to prove herself. She would not let her family's rejection define her. She had to find a way to survive. She had to find a way to show the world that she was more than just a barren princess. In the distance, as she trudged along the dusty path, Lyra saw a group of soldiers. They were humans, part of a peacekeeping force that had been stationed on Thalmaris for years. The peace between the humans and Thalmaris had been fragile, but it had lasted, and the soldiers had become a familiar sight in the kingdom. At first, Lyra hesitated. The humans were strangers to her, and the idea of relying on them felt wrong. But she was tired, exhausted from the long journey. She had no choice but to ask for help. She approached the soldiers, her voice quiet but firm. "Please," she said, "I need assistance." One of the soldiers, a tall man with dark hair and piercing eyes, stepped forward. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What happened to you?" he asked, his tone gentle but with a hint of suspicion. Lyra hesitated, not knowing how to explain. She could not reveal her true identity, not in her current state. She could not let them know that she was the discarded princess of Thalmaris. I was lost," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to get to the village of Corral. Can you help me?" The soldier studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We're headed that way. You can travel with us." Lyra felt a sense of relief. She knew that her journey was far from over, but for the first time since her exile, she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this human soldier could help her find her way. As the group of soldiers made their way toward Corral, Lyra walked beside the tall man who had spoken to her. His name, she learned, was Lieutenant Ethan Ward. He had been stationed on Thalmaris for several years, and he was familiar with the struggles of the people. Over the next few days, Lyra and Ethan spoke often. He told her about the human world, about his experiences fighting in distant wars and seeing countless battles. He spoke of the strength of humans, their resilience, and their ability to survive in even the harshest of environments. Lyra listened intently. She had always been taught that Thalmaris was the center of the universe, that her people were the most advanced and the most powerful. But as she listened to Ethan's stories, she began to see things differently. The humans were not so different from her people after all. They, too, had faced adversity and overcome it. One evening, as they sat around a campfire, Lyra opened up to Ethan about her past. She told him about her family's rejection, her fears of being forgotten, and her longing to prove that she was capable of more than just being a princess. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice soft. "I feel so lost. My family doesn't want me. My people don't want me. I have nothing left." Ethan looked at her with understanding. "You still have yourself," he said quietly, "and that's more than enough." Lyra was taken aback by his words. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Everyone had always treated her as a symbol, a future ruler, someone who had to live up to their expectations. But Ethan saw her as she truly was, just a person, struggling to find her place in the world. "I don't know if I can ever be the ruler my people wanted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I will find my own path. I'll prove that I'm more than just a failure." Ethan smiled, his eyes kind but firm. "I believe you," he said simply. As the days passed, Lyra began to regain her strength. She had not yet figured out what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. She would not let her exile define her. She would find a new purpose, a new life, and maybe, just maybe, the humans had a lesson to teach her after all. The days passed slowly as Lyra traveled with Ethan and the group of soldiers. Each step she took brought her closer to the village of Corral, but each step also reminded her of the life she had lost. She had once been a princess, surrounded by luxury and power. Now she was a stranger in a world that felt cold and unfamiliar. As the journey continued, Lyra began to notice small things about Ethan that intrigued her. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. There was a calmness in his eyes, a steadiness in his movements, and a quiet strength in his voice. He wasn't the type of person who spoke often, but when he did, his words held weight. He had a way of making her feel safe, even when everything around her seemed uncertain. At night, as they sat by the campfire, Lyra would often find herself staring into the flames, lost in her thoughts. Ethan, noticing her silence, would sit beside her, offering her a quiet company that she had come to appreciate. Sometimes they didn't need to speak at all. They simply shared the peacefulness of the moment, the warmth of the fire, and the silence of the wilderness around them. One evening, as the sun began to set and the stars slowly appeared in the sky, Ethan spoke. "You seem different from the others," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "I can see it in your eyes. You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Lyra was quiet for a moment. She had always been taught to hide her emotions, to wear the mask of a leader even when her heart was breaking. But with Ethan, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the urge to speak the truth. "I was born to lead," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought I could make a difference. I wanted to show my people that I could rule, that I was worthy. But I failed." Ethan didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, his expression kind and understanding. After a moment, he nodded, slowly. "Do you believe you're a failure?" he asked. Lyra blinked, surprised by the question. No one had ever asked her that before. She had always been told what she was, what she should do, and what her future should look like. But now, in this moment, as she sat by a campfire in the wilderness, she was forced to confront the question for herself. "I don't know," she said softly. "I've spent my life trying to live up to others' expectations. My father, my people. They all expected me to be perfect, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't give them the air they wanted." Ethan leaned back against a tree, his eyes never leaving her face. "You know," he began, "there's more to being a leader than giving people what they want. Leadership isn't about meeting expectations. It's about making hard choices, facing challenges and doing what's right, even when it's difficult." Lyra looked at him, a faint spark of curiosity in her eyes. "But I've failed. I can't give my people what they need." Ethan's gaze softened. "You're wrong. You don't have to give them anything. You just have to show them who you are, and that will be enough." His words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. She had always believed that her worth was tied to her ability to produce an heir, to carry on her family's bloodline. But Ethan had given her a different perspective, a perspective where her worth wasn't determined by what she could give to others, but by who she was as a person. Over the next few days, Lyra and Ethan continued to talk, slowly building a bond that neither had expected. Lyra learned more about Ethan's past. He told her about his childhood on Earth, about the struggles he had faced growing up in a small town. He spoke of the wars he had fought in, the battles he had seen, and the loss he had experienced. Yet despite all of it, Ethan remained kind, patient, and determined to do what was right. His strength didn't come from power or position. It came from his heart. In turn, Lyra shared more of her own story. She told him about her life as a princess, the expectations placed on her, and the pressure she had felt to be perfect. She told him about the fear she had felt when her father cast her out, when her people turned their backs on her. But she also spoke of the dreams she had once had, the hopes she had for her world and her people. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra began to see herself in a new light. She no longer saw herself as the failed princess. She was a person, with dreams, fears, and desires just like anyone else. She had a strength inside her that she had never recognized before. And as she spent more time with Ethan, she began to realize that she was not alone in her journey. One night, as they sat around the fire, Lyra looked at Ethan and spoke, her voice filled with sincerity. "Ethan," she said, "I've been thinking maybe I've been wrong all this time. I thought that I had to be something I wasn't. I thought I had to follow the path that was laid out for me. But now, with you here, I feel like I can choose my own path." Ethan smiled softly, his eyes filled with understanding. You don't have to be anyone other than yourself, Lyra. You don't have to follow anyone else's expectations. Your path is yours to choose. Lyra nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Free from the expectations of her father, her people, and the royal bloodline that had defined her existence. She could be who she wanted to be, and that was enough. But as much as Lyra had come to trust Ethan, she knew that their journey was far from over. The threat of the royal council still loomed over them. They were still being hunted, still being chased by those who saw Lyra's exile as an opportunity to rid themselves of the royal line entirely. It was on the 5th night after their conversation that they were ambushed. Lyra and Ethan had stopped to rest in a quiet forest glade, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of nature. But the calm was shattered when a group of armed soldiers appeared from the shadows, their faces hidden behind dark masks. Ethan's hand moved quickly to his side where his weapon was kept, but before he could react, the soldiers spoke, their voices cold and menacing. "Princess Lyra," one of them said, "you are under arrest. Come with us, or we will be forced to take you by force." Lyra's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She had been in dangerous situations before, but never like this. These soldiers were not just ordinary guards. They were part of the royal council's elite force, sent to ensure that she never returned to the throne. Ethan stepped forward, his body tense and ready for action. "You'll have to go through me first," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "Ciao," soldiers sneered, clearly underestimating Ethan, but they were not prepared for his skill. In a blur of movement, Ethan drew his weapon and fired, taking down the first soldier before anyone had a chance to react. Lyra watched in awe as Ethan fought, his movements quick and precise. He was a warrior, a man who had faced death and survived. And as he fought to protect her, Lyra realized something. She had never been truly alone. She had always had the strength to fight for herself. But now, with Ethan by her side, she knew that together they could face anything. The battle was swift, but intense. Ethan's skill and experience proved to be too much for the royal soldiers. Within minutes, they were defeated, lying unconscious or fleeing into the night. Breathing heavily, Ethan turned to Lyra. "We need to keep moving," he said. "The council will send more after us. We can't stay here." Lyra nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. She knew that this was just the beginning. The council would not stop until they had silenced her forever. But with Ethan by her side, she felt a new sense of hope. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey had become harder as Lyra and Ethan ventured deeper into the unknown. The peaceful glade they had rested in now felt like a distant memory. The Royal Council's soldiers, though defeated in their last skirmish, were still out there, hunting them down relentlessly. They had no choice but to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of their enemies. With each passing day, Lyra found herself questioning more and more about the path her life had taken. The peace she had once dreamed of leading her people toward seemed impossible now. The throne she had been prepared for her entire life was no longer within reach. And yet, despite everything, she could not give up. Ethan was her only ally, and he was determined to protect her. He had become more than just a soldier. Over time, he had become her confidant, the one person she could trust without question. His strength, both in battle and in spirit, had carried her through the darkest moments of their journey. But even Ethan, as strong as he was, could not protect her from the destiny that awaited her. They had reached the ruins of an ancient city, one that had once been the heart of an old alien civilization. The city had long since fallen into disrepair, its once mighty structures now reduced to crumbling stone and broken glass. But in the heart of the city, Lyra discovered something that would change the course of her life forever. A temple stood tall, untouched by the ravages of time. Inside There was a relic, an artifact that had been hidden away for centuries. The artifact, Lyra learned, was said to have the power to choose a true ruler, one who could lead the people with wisdom and strength. It was a test, an ancient trial that had been passed down through generations of Thalmaris's royal bloodline. The artifact was a beautiful crystal, glowing softly with an inner light. It was said that whoever could touch it and pass its test would be granted the title of ruler, regardless of their bloodline. It was a rare gift, one that had been lost to time. And now, it was before Lyra. For a moment, she hesitated. Could she really take the throne? Was she ready? The thought of ruling, of facing the responsibilities of a crown, filled her with doubt. But Ethan's words echoed in her mind. Leadership isn't about meeting expectations. It's about making hard choices and doing what's right. Taking a deep breath, Lyra reached out and touched the crystal. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, a surge of energy shot through her. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The artifact tested her, challenged her to prove that she was worthy. She had to face her fears, her failures, and her deepest doubts. She had to face the truth about who she really was. For what felt like an eternity, Lyra stood frozen, her mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. Then, a voice spoke, a voice that seemed to come from the very heart of the artifact. "Are you worthy to lead?" Lyra took a shaky breath and nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure of her answer. I want to be," she said quietly. "I want to prove that I can lead, that I can make a difference." The artifact pulsed brightly, and suddenly the test was over. Lyra stumbled back, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she felt a new strength inside her, a fire that hadn't been there before. The artifact had accepted her, or so it seemed. But as she looked down at her hand, she realized something. The artifact had not chosen her alone. Ethan stood beside her, watching with wide eyes. He had witnessed the entire event. And then, in the next moment, something strange happened. The crystal's glow shifted, and for a brief moment it seemed to focus on Ethan. Lyra turned to him in confusion. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What's happening?" Ethan reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered above the artifact. He had no intention of touching it, but the pull was irresistible. His fingers brushed the crystal, and in that instant, the glow intensified, enveloping him in a warm, radiant light. The same energy that had surged through Lyra now flowed through Ethan, and in that moment, Lyra knew Ethan was being chosen as well. The crystal had selected him as a ruler, a leader in a way Lyra could not understand. It had recognized something in him that she had not seen before. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. Ethan, the human soldier who had come to her aid, was now her equal in a way she had never imagined. He had been chosen as the ruler of Thalmaris. Lyra stepped back, her heart filled with a mix of confusion and fear. She had thought this was her destiny. But now, the path before her had changed completely. "Ethan, no, this can't be," Lyra stammered, her voice faltering. But Ethan, for the first time since their journey began, seemed certain of himself. He turned to her, his face full of understanding. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly. "But neither did you. I don't know what the future holds, Lyra. But I do know one thing. You've been chosen too. You're just as much a part of this as I am." Lyra couldn't speak. She was overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The royal bloodline, the expectations of her people, the exile. All of it had led her here to this moment where she and Ethan stood together, chosen by the artifact to lead Thalmaris. "You're not alone," Ethan added, his voice steady. "And neither am I," We'll face this together. Lyra nodded slowly, unsure of what to do next. The weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon them was enormous. But with Ethan at her side, she felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, and there would be those who fought against them. But Lyra knew one thing for sure. She and Ethan were not the same people they had been when they started this journey. They had both changed, grown stronger in ways they hadn't anticipated. As they left the ancient temple and began the long journey back to the capital, Lyra and Ethan talked about the future. They discussed how they would bring peace to Thalmaris, how they would work together to unite the people. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were no longer afraid. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt a sense of peace. The throne was no longer just a symbol of power. It was a responsibility, one that she and Ethan would share. Together, they would build a new future for Thalmaris, one where strength came not from bloodlines, but from the hearts of the people. As the days passed, the journey grew harder. The royal council would not give up so easily. Their soldiers continued to hunt Lyra and Ethan, determined to put an end to their newfound hope. But Lyra and Ethan stood firm, ready to face whatever came their way. They knew they were meant to lead, and they would not allow the past to dictate their future. The battle for Thalmaris had only just begun. Lyra and Ethan stood at the edge of the royal city of Thalmaris, looking down at the magnificent palace that had once been her home. The towering spires, the marble halls, the grand throne room where she had been told time and time again that she would one day rule. All of it seemed distant now. It was no longer just about the throne. It was about the future of their world, the people they would lead, and the challenges they would face together. The royal council, those who had once supported her father, had long since turned against her. They had seen her as weak, as a failure, and had cast her aside without a second thought. They had believed that without an heir, Thalmaris would fall into chaos. But now, with Ethan by her side, she knew that there was more to leadership than bloodlines and royal titles. They had both been chosen for this role, and they would not let anyone take it away from them. "I never imagined this would be the path I'd walk," Lyra said, her voice quiet as she gazed out at the city below. Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "None of us did, but we're here now, and we have the chance to make things right." It was true. Thalmaris had been in turmoil ever since Lyra's exile. The people had been divided, unsure of who to follow or what to believe. The royal family's fall had left a power vacuum, and in that void, chaos had taken root. The council, though still holding power, had lost their grip on the people. They had become corrupt, greedy, and more interested in their own interests than the well-being of the kingdom. But now, Lyra and Ethan had a chance to change that. They had the artifact's blessing, and they had the support of the people who were ready for change. The question was, how would they take back the throne and restore order to the land? "We need to gather support," Lyra said, her voice growing stronger. "The people need to know that we're here to restore peace, not just to claim power. We need to prove to them that we can lead." Ethan nodded in agreement. "We start by finding those who still believe in the old ways, those who have the courage to stand with us." The two of them set out to meet with the leaders of the various factions across Thalmaris. They knew that it would be no easy task. Many of the old leaders had aligned themselves with the council out of fear, while others had simply given up hope. But Lyra and Ethan were determined. They would convince them that there was a better way, a new path forward for the kingdom. Their first stop was the village of Corral, the same village where Lyra had first sought refuge after her exile. The villagers had long been oppressed by the royal council's taxes and laws, and they had suffered greatly under the rule of those who cared only for their own power. But when Lyra and Ethan arrived, they were greeted with open arms. The village elder, a wise woman named Elysia, welcomed them warmly. "We've heard whispers of your return," she said, her voice full of hope. "Many of us never believed you were truly gone. We knew that one day you would come back to us." Lyra felt a rush of emotion. These were the people who had once known her as their princess. But now, they saw her as something more. They saw her as a leader, someone who could bring change. "We need your help," Lyra said, her voice steady. "The council has done nothing but take from you, but together we can change that. We can build a new future for Thalmaris, one where the people's voices are heard." Elysia nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're right, Princess. The council has abandoned us, but we will stand by you. We believe in your cause." With the support of the villagers behind them, Lyra and Ethan continued their journey, gathering more allies along the way. They traveled to the distant mountains of Vale, where the nomadic tribes had long lived apart from the rest of the kingdom. The tribes had been isolated, left to fend for themselves as the council grew more corrupt. But when Lyra and Ethan arrived, they were met with a warm welcome. The chieftain of the Vale tribe, a tall and strong woman named Kaela, spoke to them with respect. "We've heard of your struggles," she said, "and we know what it's like to be abandoned. But we are not weak. We will stand with you, Princess. We will help you take back what is rightfully yours." With each new alliance, Lyra and Ethan's resolve grew stronger. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew that they were not alone. The people of Thalmaris were ready for change, and together they would fight to bring it. As they made their way back toward the capital, Lyra began to feel a sense of hope that she had not felt in years. She was no longer the princess who had been cast aside by her family. She was a leader, someone who had the power to change the fate of her world, but they were not without their enemies. The Royal Council, fearing the growing movement of support for Lyra and Ethan, had begun to make their move. They sent their soldiers to track down the rebels, to silence those who dared to stand against them. One night, as Lyra and Ethan rested, in a small outpost near the capital, they received word that the council's army was marching toward them. It was time for the final confrontation. The people who had stood with them would need to be ready to fight for the future of Thalmaris. Ethan looked at Lyra, his expression serious. "We're ready for this. We've come too far to turn back now." Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We won't stop until Thalmaris is free." The battle for Thalmaris began the next morning. The two armies clashed in the open plains just outside the capital. The Royal Council's forces were well trained and heavily armed, but they were divided, uncertain, and afraid. The rebels, on the other hand, were united by a common cause, the desire for a better future. Ethan led the charge, his weapon raised high as he fought alongside the rebels. Lyra, though not a fighter, stood at his side, rallying the troops with her words. She spoke of hope, of a future where the people would be free to live without fear of the council. She reminded them that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for the generations to come. The battle was fierce, and the tide seemed to shift back and forth as both sides fought with all their strength. But as the day wore on, the rebels gained ground. The council's forces, unable to hold their ground, began to falter. At the center of the battlefield, Lyra and Ethan stood side by side, their resolve unshaken. The Royal Council's general, a ruthless man named Roderick, approached them, his sword drawn. He sneered as he looked at Lyra. "You think you can take back the throne?" Roderick spat. "You're nothing, a failure. You're not fit to rule." Lyra stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval. I'm not here to take the throne for myself. I'm here to give the people of Thalmaris the freedom they deserve." With those words, Lyra raised her hand and the rebels surged forward, defeating the remaining council soldiers in a final push. The battle was won. As the sun set over the battlefield, Lyra and Ethan stood together, victorious. They had taken back the throne, not for power, but for the people of Thalmaris. The old dynasty was gone, and a new one had risen. The people cheered, their voices rising in unison as they celebrated their newfound freedom. Lyra and Ethan had done it. They had restored hope to a kingdom that had once been broken. In the days that followed, Lyra and Ethan worked together to rebuild Thalmaris. The council was disbanded and new leaders were chosen, leaders who would listen to the people and lead with wisdom and compassion. Lyra and Ethan ruled as co-monarchs, not as royalty by birth, but as rulers chosen by the people. Thalmaris was reborn, stronger and more united than ever before. And as Lyra looked out over the kingdom she had once thought she had lost, she knew that the future was bright. With Ethan by her side, they would lead Thalmaris into a new age of peace and prosperity. Together, they had proven that leadership is not about bloodlines, but about the strength of the heart.